Hey everyone in the VC, it's Matt, and checking in to do a video, and I'm starting a new series. So the Beach Boys reviews are still on tap. I've got 3 albums. I think that's right, 3 albums to go in that. I have the last 2 albums. I don't have the next one up. I ordered it, and I thought it would have been here by now, and I'm hoping that it'll get here by the end of this week, and then I can go ahead and finish off the Beach Boys reviews, which has been a lot of fun, and I think it's taken a year or more, maybe 2 years to get through all of those. And I'd done the Kinks albums a few years back, and that took a year and a half or so to get through all those albums. And now I'm embarking on even crazier endeavor here, which is something that me and Mr. Mayo Joe said he was looking forward to. This is going to be to review all of the solo Beatle albums in order of release, which is probably going to take 3 or 4 years to get through all of these, but I guess it'll be fun, and I'm kind of looking forward to it too. So, not to fear on the Beach Boys, they'll be back hopefully this weekend or next week. I can get the next album in order and then get the other 2 after that. And I also, as I said somewhere back there, I also do intend to do some of the solo Beach Boy releases, the Brian and the Dennis Wilson and Carl Wilson, at least anyway. But yeah, so this is going to be a big undertaking, the Beatles solo albums, and there's quite a bit to get through. Paul and Ringo have a ton of albums, so I decided I was going to just put their names in a hat or something and draw the names and start with whichever one I picked first. But then I was too lazy to do that, and I decided I'm just going to start with Paul because he's got a million solo albums, so might as well try to get those out of the way. And then after Paul, I'll move on to one of the other 3. I'm not sure yet. But so Beatles are my favorite band, as anyone who watches this channel knows. Been into them for practically all my life, and got into the Beatles before I got into the solo Beatles, which is probably the case with most people, I suppose. I don't know, maybe some people around 80 or something that were younger got into John Lennon through Double Fantasy, or got into Paul a few years before that through some of the hits in the '76 tour, and then got in the Beatles. But yeah, I didn't get into the solo Beatles right away. Got into the band, but kind of talk about that more as these videos progress. So the first Paul album, and some of these albums, including this one, I had done some just here and there reviews of various Beatles solo albums back 2 or 3 years ago. Those videos are still up. I didn't go back and watch them, but if anyone's interested, you can watch them. Maybe when I review some of these albums that I've already reviewed a second time, I might say something totally different, who knows. But I didn't review most of them, and I didn't review most of the big ones. And we're starting off with one that's not one of the very well known ones. I'm going to pretty much review just their proper catalog of solo albums. There'll be some exceptions, but some of the weird offbeat things that the various solo Beatles released, I will probably review some of them, and some of them I'll skip. Probably not going to do Thrillington. Probably not going to do I don't know how many live albums Paul has. There's 6 or 7 of them out there. Probably not going to do every single one of them. I might do 1 or 2. Not going to do all of his classical music albums, because I think there's 4 or 5 of those. I only have 1 of them, and I might do that, I might not. But I'm not going to go track those down just to review them. But I do start off with a kind of an oddball album. This would be, generally speaking, people consider George Harrison's Wonderwall to be the first solo Beatles album. That came out in 1968. This came out in '67, so technically it's the first solo Beatle album. The Family Way by Paul McCartney. This was recorded in the late part of '66, I think, sort of fall of '66 into winter of '66, and it came out in January '67 in England, came out in June of that same year in America. This was soundtrack to a movie of the same name, starring Haley Mills and some of these other people that are listed here, John Mills and so forth. That's the front cover. Here is the back cover. This is an original version. It's not in the best of shape, but it's not too bad. The record plays pretty well. And for anyone interested, the record's over there on my stereo, so I should have got that. It's just on the Black London label. Here's the inner sleeve, just advertising a bunch of other records on London Records, including a couple of Rolling Stone records there. They're out of time. So, yeah, this isn't one that many people even include in the solo catalog, but I guess technically it is. This came out on a these went out of print pretty quickly, and I remember being a kid and into the Beatles, and I'd heard of this and only ever saw it once or twice, but they went for pretty steep price back then. I'm not sure what they go for now. I got this several years ago for about $30, but I've seen it sell for more back in the 70s and 80s, and it got re-released 2 or 3 years ago at Record Store Day. I didn't get that, didn't pick it up since I already had one, but it was in the different cover. This is, I believe this is the American version, and the British version, or I could have it backwards, has these men and women symbols here, but it's like a sort of a pea green cover with a picture of Haley Mills and the guy that plays her husband in the movie. So, yeah, Paul McCartney's solo album in name only, really, because it was kind of his idea, or he was asked to do the soundtrack, or he came up with the idea of doing it. But it's George Martin doing the music and conducting an orchestra, and Paul came up with just a couple of fragments. As far as I've been able to ascertain, he just came up with some melodies which George put together into making the album. I don't think Paul plays on this at all. I think there's some pictures of him standing around while the orchestra is recording the album, sort of looking like he's doing something, but he doesn't play on it. It's all instrumental, so there's no vocals, of course. And it's a funny album because I remember wanting to hear this when I was younger and didn't have it till I finally, or just being curious about what it was. And when I finally did, it's by and large the same melody or song, but it's done at different lengths and in different styles of music, which keeps it somewhat interesting. It's doesn't sound terribly interesting from that description, but it's not a bad album. It's not one that I ever go out of my way to play, but it is something that I actually, unlike some of those weird experimental John and George albums, this is one that I do pull out every couple of years or so, and when I put it on, I find myself enjoying it. It's got certain songs are done in sort of a Spanish style, certain other ones are kind of a swing jazz, sort of cool jazz version. Some are in a classical guitar. The opening track is just sort of this grand, sort of royal British sounding orchestral swells of music that reminds me a little bit of Pink Floyd's Atom Heart Mother, the big sidelong album track, the orchestral work in that, in spirit at least anyway, if not in exact the same music. Some of this is sort of a rock and roll, sort of James Bond action sounding take on the same melody, which wouldn't have been really out of place on Pet Sounds, one of me and Mr. Mayo's favorite albums. Musically, it would have maybe fit in on that, I kind of think, or it kind of has that vibe to it, which Pet Sounds would have been out by the time this album came out, so I don't know if there's any link there or not. And then you've got some of the tracks are kind of melancholy, some are upbeat. One sounds kind of like a marching band. And so this does not sound, I know I'm not selling this album as something that sounds like anything you need to rush out and buy or great. And it's really not. This is really strictly, if you're a hardcore Beatle fan and someone like me that just has to have everything ever associated with the band ever, and otherwise this is not something that the casual fan would get much use out of. It's pretty and it's nice, and when I do put it on every year or two, I actually enjoy it, but it's not something that I'm going to go out of my way to listen to. It I don't know what it did chart wise. I don't think it did much of anything. It's funny because I think this coming out in '67, early '67, like I said, in England, and right around the time of Sergeant Pepper in America. And I just kind of funny because I think I don't know how much Beatle fans back in '67 knew what this was or didn't, but it's just kind of funny to imagine these British and American teenagers seeing this in the store and saying, "Ooh, it's a Paul McCartney album," and grabbing it up and taking it home and expecting, Beatlesque rock and pop songs and putting it on and getting this orchestral music and wondering what is this. So kind of get a grin out of that. The movie, I loved this movie when I was a kid, from about I don't know, I want to say about 75 to about 79 or 80. This used to show up on TV every once or twice a year on the afternoon movie, and I used to watch it all the time. Had a bit of a crush on Haley Mills there, and probably still do, truth be told. But it's just sort of a comedy drama thing. One of those British kitchen sink dramas is what they call those type of movies. And so it was a neat movie, and then just stopped coming on TV for whatever reason around '79 or so. And when videotape and video stores started popping up in around that time, early '80s and all, I went looking for this, wanting to watch it again, and for some reason it didn't come out on video ever. Some kind of a copyright or ownership issue. I'm not sure why. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, it got released on DVD, and I put it on my wish list on Amazon, meaning to buy it, and I didn't. And I wish I would have, because it got withdrawn pretty quick, and can't find copies of it. They went, whatever they sold out pretty quick, and hadn't been able to find a copy. So I haven't actually seen this movie since I was probably 13 or 14 or so, but I always liked it, and I hope that someday it does come back out on video, because it's a neat little movie. The album itself is no great shakes, but it is enjoyable, and kind of an inauspicious start to the Beatles solo records. On a scale of 1 to 10, I guess I'll give this a 6, because the music is actually pretty enjoyable. Paul McCartney, like I said, doesn't really have all that much to do with this, other than having his name slapped on the cover, and he apparently hummed little bits of melody to George Martin, who then translated that into the actual music. Yeah, it's a neat little curiosity, but hardly anything that anyone needs unless you're just a huge Beatle fan, or maybe if you're a huge Haley Mills fan. So that's the start of that, and we'll be back with a McCartney album that Paul had quite a bit more to do with.